6. Revelation 12, 1 to 6. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days.
Thank you, Adrian, for reading for us this morning, and welcome everyone. It's good to be here with you today and to welcome you. If you're visiting with us today, we're very glad that you're here. We've been following through this series of lessons from the book of Revelation, and it's quite a challenging series, and there's some difficult things going on here. But we've seen in the first 11 chapters of the book that they have given encouragement to the church in John's time in its struggle against the world of the ungodly. The church is assured that God is in control of all things, and ultimate victory belongs to Christ and his people, even though they may have to go through some times of trouble, some suffering and persecution. Now in chapters 12 to 14 show us that behind the struggles that are taking place on earth, a spiritual conflict has been going on between Christ and Satan. The forces that are against Christ and the church are motivated by Satan himself. The church is involved in a spiritual warfare, as Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, for we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. And what Paul writes of here in that verse is seen by John in the form of a vision in these chapters. In chapters 12 to 14, 7 scenes are depicted which form this vision which John sees here, culminating in a harvest which depicts the judgment of the earth. So the 7 signs here are in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. We see a woman who is about to give birth to a child. In chapter 12, verses 3 to 6, we see a great red dragon waiting to devour the child when it's born. In chapter 12, verses 7 to 17, we see a war going on in heaven between Michael and the dragon. In chapter 13, verses 1 to 10, we see a fearsome beast come up out of the sea. In chapter 13, verses 11 to 18, we see another beast come up from the earth with the number 666. In chapter 14, verses 1 to 5, we see the Lamb and the 144,000 on Mount Zion who are singing a new song of praise to God. And in chapter 14, verses 6 to 20, we have the judgment of the earth depicted as a harvest. Well, this morning we're going to have a look at chapter 12 here and the first 3 of these 7 signs. John introduces the scene for us in chapter 12 and verse 1. He says, and a great portent appeared in heaven. The New International Version translates this as a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. The word sign or portent or wonder, which was from the version Adrian read, is the word that John used in his gospel for the miracles of Jesus. in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, where he says, now Jesus did many other signs. And John is talking about the miracles there. And John calls the miracles signs because they point to something. Like we might see a road sign pointing in a certain direction, or a sign giving us some information. Well, this is what the miracles are. They are a sign pointing to something. And this is what John describes this, what he sees here as this sign or this portent, because it's pointing to something. And the great sign that John sees in heaven here in verse 1 is of a woman clothed in the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. This woman is surrounded by the glory and the splendor of the sun and the moon and the stars, but she's in pain. She's with child, and she is crying out in anguish as she awaits the delivery of her child. That's the first sign. John then describes another portent or sign in heaven in verse 3. He now sees a great red dragon. The dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems or crowns upon his 7 heads. He has this great tail that sweeps through the heavens, and a third of the stars of the heaven fall onto the earth. So he has this appearance of power with these heads and the horns and the crowns. And he appears to act with authority. They're sweeping down all of these stars. And this dragon stood before the woman, waiting for her to give birth, so that he could devour the child when it comes forth. However, when she does give birth, and she gives birth to a baby boy, the child is caught up to God and to his throne. And then the woman flees into the wilderness to a place that has been prepared for her by God, where she is nourished for 1,260 days. So what's this all about? What's this? What are these signs pointing to? Well, the woman who is expecting a child would seem to be the woman whose seed would defeat the serpent, spoken of in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where God said to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Historically, of course, the woman who gave birth to Jesus Christ was Mary. But in this case, in this sign, the woman isn't just Mary, isn't just one woman, but representative of the line through whom the Christ would come into the world. The great red dragon with the 7 heads and the 10 horns and the 7 crowns is Satan, the serpent of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, who would oppose the seed of the woman. And the description of him there emphasizes the power that he exercises over his domain, that he has 7 heads. Remember, 7 is the perfect number, 10 is the complete number, 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns, emphasizing his power. In John chapter 12, verse 31, Jesus spoke of him as the ruler of this world. And Paul speaks of him as the God of this world in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. His readiness to devour the child as soon as it is born indicates his opposition and his intention to destroy the work of this child. During his ministry, Jesus had to had to confront the powers of evil in the form of Satan. Jesus faced temptation from Satan. And Jesus had to confront the evil spirits in those who were possessed by them. The child born to the woman is a male child, we're told, and a child who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And that really helps us to identify this child as the Messiah, as the Christ. Psalm 2 and verse 9 is a messianic psalm. It's applied to Jesus in the New Testament. And Psalm 2 and verse 9 addresses him, God addresses him saying, you shall break them, the nations, with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces. So that would seem to identify this child here as the Messiah, as the coming Christ. The dragon is unsuccessful in destroying the child because the child is caught up to God and to God's throne. And that would suggest Christ's ascension into heaven. The Satan might have thought that he was successful, that he had won when Jesus died on the cross. But the resurrection and his ascension to heaven, where he is seated on the throne with God, shows Satan's defeat and Christ's victory. The writer to the Hebrews in chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 says, "Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same nature, that through death he might destroy him who has the power of death, that is the devil, and to deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong bondage." Jesus came in flesh and blood as we are made of flesh and blood, so that through his death he might destroy him who has the power of death, the devil. If this woman represents God's faithful people in general, then her fleeing away to the wilderness, to a place that has been prepared for her by God, would indicate God's protection of his people. This is sanctuary here. And there she is nourished for 1,260 days. Remember those days last week in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, we had that number there. It was the time of the trampling of the holy city. It was the time when the two witnesses were to prophesy. So we said last week that this number represents a definite period of time, but a limited period of time. So the woman will be protected and nourished by God for a period of time, a limited period of time. It will come eventually to an end. Well, in the next scene or the next sign, John now tells us of a war going on in heaven. This is in chapter 12 here, verses 7 to verse 7 to 12. A war going on in heaven between Michael and his angels, who are fighting against the dragon and his angels. The dragon and his angels are defeated, and they're thrown out of heaven and down to the earth. Verses 7 to 9. The dragon, which had been depicted earlier as this ferocious, terrifying, powerful creature in verses 3 and 4, is not invincible. And the dragon is now defeated by Michael and his angel. Michael, whose name means who is like God, is mentioned 3 times in the book of Daniel, where he is seen as the defender of God's people. He's also mentioned in the letter of Jude in verse 9, where he's called the archangel. So he's a chief angel. And there in Jude's letter, he is contending with the devil over the body of Moses. But here in Revelation chapter 12, Michael is acting as the representative of Christ and fighting against the dragon. And the great dragon that is defeated by Michael is identified in verse 9 as that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Calling him that ancient serpent links him to the serpent of Genesis chapter 3, who induced Eve to eat the fruit and so brought sin into the world. He's called the devil. The word devil means accuser or slanderer, because that's what he does, accuses and slanders people. He's also called Satan, and that word means adversary, opponent, or enemy, because that's what he is. He's an opponent, he's an enemy. And he is called the deceiver of the whole world, because that's what he does. It's by deception that he causes people to sin. Think of how he was in the garden and the deception that he worked upon Eve there so that she would eat that fruit. That's his method of working. So what is this war that's going on in heaven here? When did it happen? And is it yet to happen? Well, there are, as we might expect, some different views on this. Some suggest that soon after God had created the heavens and the earth, there was a war in heaven between God and Satan, in which Satan was defeated and he and his angels were thrown out of heaven and they came down to earth. That's one view. Another view is that there was a war in heaven when Satan attempted to invade heaven and to destroy the male child who had been taken up to heaven. So happening at the time of Christ's ascension. And again, Satan was defeated and cast down to the earth. The third view is that, well, this is not speaking of an actual war that has taken place. This is a vision. This is a symbol of the spiritual war that has been going on ever since sin came into this world, and which reaches its culmination in Christ's victory over Satan through his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. And this view is the one that is really most consistent with the view that the book of Revelation is a book of symbols using highly figurative language and it not to be interpreted literally. We're not reading history here. It's not a historical account of something that happened in heaven, but it's a symbol, a figure of something else, another reality that is going on. So the defeat of Satan and his angels then leads to the proclamation of the victory of God and his Christ in verses 10 to 12 of chapter 12. John now hears a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." This voice is proclaiming the victory of God and his Christ and the defeat of the accuser, the one who accuses our brethren. God's purpose of providing salvation, of demonstrating his power and establishing his kingdom has now been fulfilled. The defeat of the accuser has led then to the coming of Christ's authority, and Christ possesses that authority now. In Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18, Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Victory is assured because of what God and Christ have done. The war in heaven then, which John is shown in this vision, is this conflict that has been going on ever since sin came into the world in the Garden of Eden. But the war has been won. It's been won by Christ, and Satan is the defeated enemy. In Colossians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, Paul tells us that by Christ's death on the cross, God has disarmed the principalities and powers and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in him. Because of what Christ did on the cross, then these powers have been rendered powerless. In John chapter 12, verses 31 and 32, predicting the effect of his own death, Jesus said, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." There Jesus saying that by his death, he would conquer, that he would defeat Satan, that by his death would come the judgment of the world, and the ruler of this world would be cast out. It is Christ's victory over Satan then that enables his people to also be victorious. As in verse 11, the voice from heaven continues, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Christ's people have conquered by the blood of the Lamb. Christ's death upon the cross, the shedding of his blood, was the provision that God made for our salvation and our forgiveness. And by that blood, we too have conquered Satan. And further, they have conquered, the voice says, by the word of their testimony, that they held fast to their confession of faith in Christ in face of the opposition and the persecution. and they were prepared to die for their faith. They loved not their lives even unto death. That even if it cost them their lives, they were going to remain faithful to Christ. And many Christians in John's time suffered in that way. So for the sake of Christ and the gospel, they disregarded their own lives, counted their own lives as of no value. And it is the blood of Christ and our response to the shedding of his blood which will give us the victory over Satan as well. That when we procure for ourselves the effect of Christ's blood in our lives, we are victorious. And the declaration of victory is received with rejoicing in verse 12 of the chapter. Rejoice then, O heaven, and you that dwell therein. Heaven and those who dwell in heaven are called upon to rejoice. And in contrast to the rejoicing in heaven, there is a woe to come upon the earth and the sea. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. The earth and the sea have now become the sphere of Satan's activities. He's come down angry, in great wrath, because he knows his time is short. And Satan may continue to exert some influence in this world, but his opportunity is limited. It won't last forever. His final defeat and destination have already been determined. Well, the story of the woman who gave birth to the baby boy is now picked up again in verses 13 to 17 of chapter 12. We go back to what happened to her now. The dragon had wanted to destroy the child, but the child was taken to safety, to God and his throne. And so now the dragon turns his attention to the woman who gave birth to the child. He pursued or persecuted her with the intent of doing her harm, in verse 13. And if the woman here represents the faithful people of God, this would indicate Satan's efforts to persecute the church. Jesus had warned his disciples that this would happen. In John chapter 15, verse 20, he said, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. However, the woman is rescued. She is given the two wings of a great eagle so that she might escape from the serpent into the wilderness, where she is nourished, we're told in verse 14, for a time and times and half a time. And that phrase is the equivalent of verse 6, 1,260 days. Again, it's that limited period of time. When God delivered Israel from Egypt, he said that he had borne them on eagle's wings. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So the eagle's wings suggest God's work of protection. And the woman is carried away to the wilderness by eagle's wings, depicting God's protection of his people and his provision for their well-being. They're flown off to a place of safety. But the serpent still tries to destroy the woman, and water pours from his mouth like a river, threatening to sweep away the woman in this flood of water. And God's people are often pictured as being threatened by floods of water. The flood of water represents Satan's efforts to destroy the church through his lies and his deceptions. However, the woman is saved when the earth comes to her aid by opening up and swallowing the river that came out of the dragon's mouth. Well, the dragon becomes angry again with the woman because he has failed to destroy her. And so now he goes off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Verse 17 says, those who keep the commandments of God and bear testimony to Jesus. The woman may be seen as the people of God collectively as one body, whilst her offspring are individual Christians or members of the church. Satan had failed in his attempt to destroy the church as a whole, but he still tries to attack individual Christians. But again, he fails. Satan is persistent in his efforts to destroy the people of God, but he always fails. He always ends up being defeated. Well, through these striking pictures, John has shown us that Christ came into the world to destroy the devil and his works. And Satan's efforts to destroy him and his people have all failed. Christ won the victory on the cross, confirmed it by his resurrection and his ascension to heaven. And now Christ's victory is the guarantee that his people will also be victorious whenever accused by Satan, either as a whole body or as individual members of that body. That Satan's efforts to destroy the church will also fail. They always fail. And we have not conquered Satan by our own efforts, or by our own strength, or by our own achievements. The key verse in this chapter, I think, is verse 11. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. It is the blood of the Lamb that enables us to overcome Satan, to overcome the accusations of Satan. And it is a call for us to bear witness to Christ, even unto death. They loved not their lives, even unto death. May these words then confirm us in our own faith, and may they give us the encouragement that we need to persevere. Thank you, and God bless you.
That's a powerful message to each and every one of us. And I choose this song as well. Jesus, hold my hand.